Around 6,000 years ago, something happened in Britain that nobody living through it could have predicted, and that nobody alive today fully understands. A population that had occupied this island for over 30,000 years, through ice ages, through the drowning of an entire continent, through every environmental upheaval the world threw at them, disappeared. Not slowly, not partially. Within a few centuries, they were gone. And the people who replaced them came from a world so different that the two might as well have been different species. One hunted the forest, the other cleared it. One moved with the seasons, the other stayed put and made the land stay with them. What happened when those two worlds met on this island is one of the most dramatic stories in all of British prehistory, and most people have never heard it. To understand what changes, you first have to understand what exists. Britain in 4500 BCE is a forested island, almost entirely covered in ancient woodland, oak, elm, lime, and hazel, so dense in places that it would shade out a modern walker within minutes of leaving a clearing. This is not wilderness in the sense of emptiness. It is a landscape that has been lived in, managed, and known intimately by the same people for 4,000 years. The families moving through it now are the inheritors of a knowledge system that stretches back to the Ice Age. Every seasonal resource mapped in memory, every animal's movement known, every productive stretch of river and coastline worked across generations. These people are hunter-gatherers, and that term does them a disservice. It implies simplicity, transience, a hand-to-mouth existence that the evidence simply does not support. Their seasonal round is a precisely planned calendar of resource exploitation. Winter camps in sheltered valley sites, spring movement toward river mouths as the fish runs begin, summer ranging across wide territories following deer herds, autumn return to the hazel stands for the nut harvest that carries them through the cold months. Each stage flows from the last with a logic refined across thousands of years of accumulated observation. They are not wandering. They are executing a system. The tools they use are the most refined stone technology Britain has ever seen. Tiny, precisely made flint blades hafted into composite arrows and spears whose individual components can be replaced in minutes when they break. They build semi-permanent structures at the sites they return to each year. They manage the woodland around their camps deliberately, burning edges to promote hazel growth, maintaining clearings around water sources to concentrate the animals they depend on. They trade materials across hundreds of miles of exchange networks that link every community on the island into a connected social world. They bury their dead with ceremony. They mark objects with meaning. They are, by any honest measure, sophisticated. And in 4500 BCE, they have no reason to think any of this is about to end. The forest is intact, the deer herds are healthy, the exchange networks function, the knowledge system that has sustained them through ice ages and the drowning of the land bridge to Europe is operating at full efficiency. Somewhere across the channel, a different kind of people are already clearing forests, planting crops, and building permanent settlements in ways that will eventually reach Britain. But in 4500 BCE, the island is still entirely theirs. The last fully hunter-gatherer generations in British history are going about their lives in a world that still makes complete sense. And what is coming will make almost none of it. The question this video answers is not simply what happens when farmers arrive in Britain. That part of the story is relatively short. The more interesting question is what the collision between these two worlds actually looked like, whether it was violent or quiet, sudden or gradual, whether the people already here fought or adapted or simply faded, and why a population that had survived everything the world threw at it for 30,000 years could not survive the arrival of a new way of living. The answer turns out to be more complicated and more human than either the old story of inevitable progress or the newer story of straightforward conquest. The people who will transform Britain arrived from far away. Their ancestry traces ultimately to Anatolia, the region of modern Turkey, where agriculture first developed around 10,000 BCE. They did not come directly from there. By the time they reached Britain, they had been moving westward across Europe for thousands of years, generation by generation, adapting to new landscapes, absorbing small amounts of local ancestry along the way. They are the descendants of a migration so vast and so sustained that it reshaped the entire human population of Europe. Agriculture began in the Near East in the region archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from modern Iraq through Syria and into Turkey. Around 10,000 BCE, people in this region began deliberately cultivating wild grasses, selecting the plants that produced the most seed and keeping animals rather than hunting them. The shift did not happen overnight. It took thousands of years of gradual intensification before farming became the dominant subsistence strategy. But once it did, the populations practicing it grew faster than anything that came before. The reason farming populations grow so fast is simple. A fixed area of farmed land supports far more people than the same area of hunted and gathered land. A hunter-gatherer band needs a wide territory to sustain itself, typically several square miles per person. A farming community on the same ground can feed 10, 20, sometimes 50 times as many people. More people means more children. More children means the population expands. And expanding populations need more land, which pushes the farming frontier outward season by season, generation by generation, relentlessly westward. The genetic evidence for this westward expansion is precise and consistent. Every time the Neolithic appears in the European archaeological record, in Greece, in the Balkans, in Central Europe. Along the Mediterranean coast, it arrives with a new genetic signature traceable back to Anatolia. These are not local hunter-gatherers who learned farming from their neighbors. They are the descendants of people who were already farmers, moving into new territory and bringing their entire way of life with them. The ancient DNA from Neolithic sites across Europe tells the same story from Greece to Ireland. Farming came with farmers. The route to Britain is not the one you might expect. The most direct path from continental Europe to Britain runs across what is now the southern North Sea. But Doggerland flooded long before the farmers arrive. The genetic evidence from Neolithic British individuals shows they are most closely related not to Central European Neolithic populations, but to Iberian and Mediterranean ones. And the farmers who reached Britain came up the Atlantic coast, moving through what is now Spain and France, following the western seaboard northward, crossing the channel in boats when Britain came within range. They are Mediterranean people who have traveled the long way around. By the time they cross into Britain around 4000 BCE, these people have been farmers for dozens of generations. They carry domesticated cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. They carry seed stock of emmer wheat and einkorn, early varieties of cultivated grain that bear little resemblance to modern wheat, but that, planted and harvested correctly, produce reliable calories from a small plot of land. They carry pottery, a technology with no Mesolithic equivalent in Britain, containers for storing, cooking, and fermenting food that fundamentally change what it is possible to eat and preserve. They carry a completely different relationship with the land than anyone who has ever lived in Britain before them. What they look like surprises modern audiences in a different direction from the hunter-gatherers. The ancient DNA from early European farmers shows they had largely dark hair and dark eyes, consistent with a Mediterranean ancestry. But crucially, they carried genetic variants associated with lighter skin pigmentation that the Western hunter-gatherers of Britain largely lacked. The farmers arriving in Britain are not pale by modern Northern European standards, but they are lighter-skinned on average than the people already here. The visual difference between the two populations would have been immediately apparent to anyone who encountered both. They also look different in build. Skeletal analysis consistently shows that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Europe were taller and more robustly built than the early European farmers who replaced them, a pattern so consistent that it appears across the continent wherever both populations have been studied. The farmers are shorter, more gracile, with bone structures reflecting a different diet and a different pattern of physical activity. A Mesolithic man and a Neolithic farmer standing side by side would have been visibly distinct from each other in height, in build, in skin tone, in the tools they carried and the clothes they wore. These were not populations who would have been mistaken for the same kind of people. The package they bring with them, domesticated animals, cultivated crops, pottery, permanent settlement, monument building, is so internally coherent that archaeologists call it simply the Neolithic package. It does not arrive piecemeal. Wherever the Neolithic appears in Europe, it appears as a bundle. The same combination of practices, the same material culture, the same fundamental reorganization of the relationship between people and land. The package works as a system. Individual elements borrowed in isolation, keeping a few goats without farming grain or using pottery without clearing forest, do not produce the same demographic outcome. The whole system, adopted whole, is what generates the population growth that drives the expansion. The animals they bring are worth pausing on because they represent something genuinely new in Britain. Cattle, sheep, and goats do not exist in Britain before the Neolithic. Wild aurochs do, the enormous ancestor of domestic cattle standing 6 feet at the shoulder. But they are hunted, not herded. Domesticated cattle are a fundamentally different proposition. Animals bred over generations for reduced aggression and increased docility, manageable by people on foot, capable of providing meat, milk, blood, traction, and hide from a single kept animal across its working life. The first time a Mesolithic person in Britain sees a herd of domestic cattle being driven along a cleared path by a farmer who owns them, they are looking at something that has no equivalent in their entire cultural experience. The farmers do not announce themselves. There is no single moment of arrival, no fleet landing on a beach, no confrontation that the archaeology records as a clear before and after. What the evidence shows instead is a gradual appearance. Domesticated animal bones appearing in the faunal record of southern coastal sites, pottery fragments showing up where no pottery has ever existed, cereal pollen beginning to register in lake sediment cores from Kent and Sussex around 4100 BCE. The Neolithic does not invade Britain. It arrives at the edges quietly and begins spreading inward. The 1,000-year delay between farming establishing itself in adjacent parts of continental Europe and its appearance in Britain has puzzled researchers for decades. Farming is well established in northern France by 5000 BCE. Now, Britain lies across a channel crossing that Mesolithic people were already making regularly by boat. The physical barrier is not the explanation. The most likely answer sits in the Boulder Cliff evidence discussed in the previous video. The Mesolithic Britons knew about farming, had obtained its products through exchange networks, and had chosen for a very long time not to adopt it. The delay is not ignorance, it is a decision. What changes around 4100 BCE is not the knowledge available to the people of Britain, but the scale of the farming population pressing against the channel from the other side. By this point, the Neolithic has been building demographic momentum across Western Europe for centuries. The farming communities of northern France are not a handful of experimental settlers. They are an established, growing population with a land hunger that the British coastline, visible on clear days from the French shore, can no longer be ignored. The crossing happens. And when it does not come as individuals. It comes as communities. The first evidence of what contact between the two populations looked like comes from the isotopic record rather than the genetic one. strontium isotope analysis of human teeth from early Neolithic burial sites in southern Britain identifies individuals whose childhood signatures match continental European geology, people who were born on the continent and moved to Britain as adults. These are not the children of settlers already established on British soil. They are first-generation migrants, people who made the crossing themselves and carrying with them the full weight of a farming culture built across dozens of generations on the other side of the Channel. The two populations would have been immediately distinguishable to each other. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain, darker-skinned, taller, more robustly built, carrying microliths and bone tools, moving through the forest on foot. And the incoming farmers, shorter, more lightly built, herding domesticated cattle, clearing ground for crops, building structures designed to stay in one place. The visual, cultural, and practical differences between these two groups are not subtle. They are meeting people who organize the world in a fundamentally different way, and both sides know it within the first encounter. What those early encounters actually involved is something the archaeology can only partially reconstruct. There is evidence for exchange, Neolithic pottery appearing at sites that otherwise show entirely Mesolithic tool assemblages, suggesting trade or gift exchange between communities that maintained separate identities. There is evidence for some movement of people in both directions. A small number of early Neolithic individuals in Britain carry detectable levels of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry, suggesting intermarriage at the margins. What there is almost no evidence for, in Britain specifically, is the kind of sustained coexistence and mutual genetic mixing that appears at the Neolithic frontier in parts of continental Europe. In Britain, the boundary between the two populations holds, until it does not. The cattle the farmers bring across deserve attention as objects of encounter. Aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, already live in Britain, hunted occasionally by Mesolithic communities who know them as dangerous, unpredictable animals avoided in close contact. The domesticated cattle the farmers bring are visibly related to aurochs, but behaviorally transformed, smaller, less aggressive, manageable by people on foot, following their herders rather than fleeing them. A Mesolithic hunter watching a farmer drive a herd of cattle along a cleared path is watching an animal they know reimagined as something entirely different, not prey to be stalked, but property to be managed. The conceptual distance between those two relationships with the same animal is vast. The speed with which farming spreads across Britain once it begins is striking. The earliest Neolithic evidence in Britain dates to around 4100 BCE in the southeast. Within 2 to 3 centuries, Neolithic material culture, pottery, domesticated animal bones, cereal pollen, the first long barrows, appears at sites from Cornwall to Yorkshire to Scotland. For a population crossing an open sea and establishing itself in a forested island already occupied by another people, this rate of spread implies something more organized and more sustained than a gradual trickle of settlers. The ancient DNA is consistent with this. The genetic signature of the incoming farmers appears across Britain's Neolithic record almost simultaneously, without the gradual gradient you would expect from a slow diffusion. These people moved fast. The most visible thing the farmers do when they arrive in Britain is cut down the trees. Not selectively, not carefully. They clear ground wholesale, felling ancient woodland that has been standing for thousands of years to make room for crops and pasture. The pollen record from lake sediment cores across Britain documents this with a precision that archaeology rarely achieves. Above a certain layer, the tree pollen drops sharply. Grass pollen, weed pollen, and cereal pollen surge to replace it. The line between the Mesolithic and Neolithic is readable in the sediment as clearly as a line drawn with a pen. The elm decline is the most dramatic signal in the record. Between 4,300 and 3,250 BCE, millions of elm trees disappear from Britain. The pollen cores show it as a sudden, widespread collapse. Not localized, not gradual, but a near simultaneous crash across the island. The cause is still debated. The leading explanation is Dutch elm disease spread by bark beetles, possibly accelerated deliberately by farmers who stripped elm bark for animal fodder and in doing so exposed the trees to infection. Whether deliberate or incidental, the result is the same. One of the most common trees in the British wildwood is effectively eliminated within a few centuries of the farmer's arrival. The tool that makes forest clearance possible on this scale is the polished stone axe, a Neolithic innovation with no Mesolithic equivalent. Ground and polished from hard igneous rock, these axes hold an edge far better than flaked flint and can cut through a mature oak trunk in a way that no previous British technology could manage efficiently. The Great Langdale Axe Factory in the Lake District was producing them in quantity by around 3,800 BCE, roughed out on the mountain slopes and finished by grinding at lower sites, then distributed through exchange networks across the whole of Britain. Some were traded as far as Ireland. An axe that has never been used, too fine to risk on a tree, has been found buried in contexts suggesting it was treated as a prestige object. Even the tool of destruction carried social meaning. Slash and burn is the primary clearance method. Trees are felled, the undergrowth cut back, and the whole area burned. The burn clears the debris, kills off competing vegetation, and releases nutrients locked in the woody material into the soil as ash. A brief fertility boost that makes the cleared ground productive for crops in the first seasons after clearing. The charcoal from these burns is preserved in lake sediment cores and in archaeological contexts across Britain, and it is one of the clearest markers of Neolithic arrival at any given location. The landscape essentially announces the presence of farmers through its own chemistry. The fields that replace the forest are not the rolling agricultural landscapes of later periods. Early Neolithic farming in Britain is small-scale, shifting, and impermanent. A plot is cleared, cultivated for a few seasons, and then abandoned as the soil fertility declines, and the farmers move on to clear the next area. Secondary woodland begins regenerating on the abandoned plots almost immediately. Hazel and birch re-establish within decades, oak more slowly. The pollen record from some sites shows repeated cycles of clearance and regeneration across the early Neolithic, the woodland advancing and retreating in pulses that map the rhythm of a farming system that is still finding its footing on a new island. For the hunter-gatherer communities watching this happen, the transformation of the forest is not an abstraction. The hazel stands they have managed and harvested for generations are being felled. The deer that move through familiar woodland corridors are retreating from the cleared areas. The streams that ran through shaded channels are running differently as the tree cover disappears from their catchments, warmer, more variable, their banks eroding without the root systems that held them in place. Every change in the forest is a change in the resources that sustain Mesolithic life. And then the changes are coming from outside, imposed by people whose relationship with the land operates on a completely different logic. The Sweet Track in the Somerset Levels offers a different kind of evidence for what the early Neolithic landscape looked like. Built around 3807 BCE, a date so precise it was established by dendrochronology, counting the growth rings of the oak planks used in its construction. It is a raised wooden walkway crossing a wetland, connecting areas of higher ground across the expanding marsh. The timber used in its construction was felled from managed woodland. The growth ring patterns show the trees had been coppiced, cut back repeatedly to produce straight poles of consistent size. The farmers building the Sweet Track were not simply destroying the forest, they were also learning to manage it in new ways, harvesting it on a rotation that kept it productive while supplying the timber their settlements required. The landscape that emerges from the first centuries of Neolithic farming in Britain is a patchwork: cleared fields and pasture on the more accessible ground, managed and recovering woodland on the slopes, wetland, and ancient wildwood persisting in the areas too steep, too wet, or too remote for easy clearance. The Mesolithic communities retreating before this patchwork are not being pushed into nothing. They are being pushed into the margins, the western coasts, the upland interiors, the islands, where the farming frontier is arriving later and where the forest they depend on is still intact. For a time, those margins hold. How long they hold and what happens when they do not is the question the next sections of this video turn to. The most visible legacy of the Neolithic in Britain is not the fields or the cleared forest. Both are long gone. It is the monuments, long barrows, causewayed enclosures, and the early earthworks that eventually lead to Stonehenge are the Neolithic's most durable contribution to the British landscape, and they begin appearing within a century or two of the farmer's arrival. They are the clearest possible statement about the difference between the two ways of life now occupying the same island. Mesolithic people left almost nothing permanent in the landscape. Neolithic people built structures meant to last forever. The Long Barrow is the first monument the farmers build in Britain, appearing from around 3,800 BCE onward. These are elongated earthen mounds, flanked by ditches, and ranging from 20 meters to over 100 meters in length. They contain the dead, not individual burials, but collective ones, the commingled bones of multiple people deposited over generations. At Hazelton North Long Barrow in Gloucestershire, the remains of 35 members of the same extended family were found in the tomb, placed there across 3 or 4 generations. The barrow is not a grave in the modern sense. It is a house for the dead that the living return to repeatedly, adding to, rearranging, maintaining a physical relationship with their ancestors across decades. The bones inside long barrows are not left undisturbed. They are curated, sorted, rearranged, sometimes moved between chambers. Skulls and long bones are handled separately from the rest of the skeleton. Individual identity is deliberately dissolved into collective ancestry. The dead become part of a communal presence rather than remaining recognizable individuals. This treatment of the dead is not random. It reflects a specific belief about what a person is after death, not a continued individual, but a resource, a source of ancestral power available to the whole community, accessible through the monument that houses them. The causewayed enclosure arrives slightly later, from around 3,700 BCE. These are large earthwork complexes, circular or oval areas enclosed by concentric ditches and banks, broken at intervals by causeways that allow access from multiple directions. They are not settlements. The archaeological evidence from the best-studied examples, Windmill Hill in Wiltshire, Hambledon Hill in Dorset, shows they were visited periodically rather than permanently occupied. They served as meeting places, feasting sites, trading locations, and places where the dead were processed before their bones were moved to long barrows. The processing of the dead at causewayed enclosures is one of the more confronting aspects of early Neolithic practice in Britain. Human bones found in the ditches at Windmill Hill and Hambledon Hill show marks consistent with excarnation, the deliberate exposure of corpses to the elements and to scavenging birds until the flesh was gone. The cleaned bones were then collected and carried to long barrows for final deposition. The body, in this system, passes through multiple stages and multiple locations before it reaches its resting place. Death is not a single event, but a process managed by the community over months or years. West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire, built around 3,670 BCE, is one of the most physically imposing early Neolithic monuments in Britain and one of the few accessible to visitors today. It is over 100 meters long, its burial chambers roofed with massive sarsen stones, its entrance flanked by a forecourt where the community gathered for the rituals associated with depositing the dead. The bones of at least 46 individuals were placed inside across several centuries of use. Men, women, and children, their remains rearranged multiple times before the entrance was finally blocked with large stones in the late Neolithic. Walking into West Kennet today, the scale of the stones overhead makes clear that this was not built quickly or casually. It was the central project of a community that had decided to anchor itself permanently to this particular piece of land. The investment in these monuments is staggering by the standards of a farming population that has been in Britain for only a few centuries. Building a long barrow requires clearing the site, quarrying or collecting the stone and earth for the mound, constructing the internal chambers, and then maintaining the monument across generations. None of this has any direct economic return. It produces no food, no shelter, no material benefit of any kind. What it produces is something harder to quantify, a claim on the landscape expressed in stone and earth that says, "We were here, our dead are here, and this land is ours in a way that no one who passes through can match." For the hunter-gatherer communities still operating in the margins of Britain, the appearance of these monuments in the landscape is a transformation of a different order from forest clearance. Clearance destroys resources. Monuments claim territory. A long barrow on a hilltop visible for miles in every direction is not just a burial site. It is a marker announcing that the land around it belongs to the people whose ancestors lie inside it. A concept of ownership rooted in the dead that the Mesolithic world, with its seasonal movement and its knowledge-based relationship with land, has no equivalent for and no answer to. The story told about the Neolithic revolution for most of the 20th century was straightforward. Farming meant more food, more stability, and the beginning of civilization. The bones tell a different story. Across 19 of 21 societies studied in the landmark 1984 volume Paleopathology at the Origins of Agriculture, the skeletal evidence showed a consistent decline in health following the shift from foraging to farming. More food per acre did not mean better health for the people producing it. It meant more people living harder lives in bodies under greater stress than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. The most consistent finding is stature. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Europe are taller on average than the Neolithic farmers who replaced them, a pattern documented across the continent wherever both populations have been studied. Late Mesolithic men from sites along the Danube are significantly taller than their early Neolithic successors at the same locations. The difference is not trivial. It reflects a real divergence in nutrition and physical development between people who ate a varied, protein-rich diet across the whole year and people whose diet was increasingly dominated by cultivated grain. The teeth confirm it from a different angle. Ancient dental calculus, calcified plaque preserved on the teeth of prehistoric individuals, was analyzed in a landmark 2013 study published in Nature Genetics. The oral microbiome of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers showed a diverse, relatively balanced bacterial population with low levels of the species associated with tooth decay. The Neolithic transition changed that balance decisively. The farming populations show a shift toward disease-associated oral bacteria consistent with a diet higher in fermentable carbohydrates, the starches from cultivated grain that feed the bacteria responsible for dental decay. The mouths of the first British farmers were measurably less healthy than the mouths of the people they replaced. Infectious disease rises with the Neolithic transition for reasons that are structural rather than incidental. Farming communities live in denser settlements than mobile hunter-gatherer bands. Density accelerates the transmission of airborne and contact diseases. Domesticated animals living in close proximity to humans provide a reservoir for zoonotic pathogens. Diseases that jump from animals to people are far more likely when cattle, sheep, and pigs are kept within the same settlement boundaries as their owners. A 2018 study recovered the genome of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, from Neolithic farming communities in Sweden, predating previously known plague outbreaks by over 1,000 years. The conditions farming creates are precisely the conditions infectious disease thrives in. Why did people adopt farming if it made them shorter, gave them worse teeth, and exposed them to new diseases? The answer lies in a distinction that the bones cannot capture. Farming does not make individual lives better. It makes populations larger. A farming community on a given area of land produces more children than a hunter-gatherer band on the same ground, and those children survive to reproductive age at higher rates even if their individual health is worse. The natural selection does not optimize for well-being. It optimizes for reproduction. Farming won not because it was better for the people who practiced it, but because it produced more of them. The enamel hypoplasia evidence, horizontal lines or grooves visible on tooth surfaces, formed when enamel growth is disrupted during periods of physiological stress, appears at higher rates in Neolithic populations than Mesolithic ones across Europe. These are population-level patterns recorded in adult teeth, reflecting the cumulative nutritional history of the farming communities that produced them. The pattern is consistent across sites. Farming populations experienced more frequent and more severe periods of nutritional stress than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. The grain harvest that could feed a community through winter could also fail. When it did, there was no alternative system to fall back on. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers is still operating in the margins of Britain during this period, are, by every skeletal measure available, healthier than the farming communities displacing them. They are taller, their teeth are better, their bones show fewer markers of nutritional stress and infectious disease. They have a more varied diet, a more mobile lifestyle that limits disease transmission, and a subsistence system robust enough to absorb a bad season without catastrophic consequences. None of this saves them. Being healthier individually is no defense against being outnumbered demographically. The farmers are producing more people faster, and in the long run, that is the only metric that matters. In 2019, a team from University College London and Harvard published a study that settled a debate archaeologists had been having for over a century. They sequenced the genomes of 6 Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and 67 Neolithic individuals found in Britain, spanning the period from 8,500 to 2,500 BCE. The result was unambiguous. The people who built the long barrows and herded cattle across cleared British fields were not the descendants of the people who had hunted the forests before them. They were a different population entirely, and the original inhabitants had almost completely vanished. The last Mesolithic woman whose genome was analyzed in the study died less than 500 years before farming appears in the British record. Her ancestry is entirely local, not a trace of continental Neolithic farmer ancestry anywhere in her genome. For the 1,000 years that farming had been established just across the Channel, the people of Britain had maintained a clear genetic boundary with the farming world pressing against their horizon. Then, within a few centuries of the farmers' arrival, that boundary collapsed. And when it collapsed almost completely. The scale of the replacement is the part that stops researchers in their tracks. Across Britain's early Neolithic sites, the hunter-gatherer genetic contribution is not diminished. It is essentially absent. The 2019 study found no resurgence of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry at any point during the British Neolithic. Not at its beginning, not in its middle, not at its end. Unlike parts of continental Europe where the two populations mixed substantially across the Neolithic frontier, in Britain, the replacement was so thorough it reads in the DNA as near total. Professor David Reich of Harvard, one of the study's co-authors, put the number plainly. Roughly 99% of the hunter-gatherer gene pool was replaced. 99%. A population that had lived on this island for over 30,000 years, that had survived ice ages and the drowning of an entire continent, that had built a sophisticated and complete way of life across 4,000 years of post-glacial adaptation, reduced to a 1% genetic trace within a few centuries. The number is so large it is almost difficult to accept. But the genomes do not argue. They simply show what happened. Yes, and what happened was the most complete population displacement in all of British prehistory. How does a replacement this thorough happen without leaving evidence of systematic violence? That is the question that genetics raises and cannot itself answer. The archaeological record for this period in Britain contains almost no confirmed massacre sites, no mass graves with perimortem trauma, no weaponry distributions suggesting organized conflict at the scale the genetic replacement would seem to require. What it contains instead is the steady expansion of Neolithic farming settlements into territory that was previously occupied by Mesolithic communities. A demographic pressure so sustained and so one-sided that it did not need to be violent to be total. The mechanism is demographic rather than military. And a farming community on a fixed area of land produces more children per generation than a mobile hunter-gatherer band on the same ground. Those children survive at higher rates, even accounting for the worse individual health the previous section described. Over several generations, the arithmetic is unforgiving. The farming population doubles and doubles again, while the hunter-gatherer population, already small and now losing ground and resources, contracts. The two populations are not fighting for the same territory. They are simply growing at different rates, and the one growing faster wins without needing to fight at all. The geography of the replacement follows a consistent pattern. It proceeds fastest in the south and east, the areas where farming arrives first and where the landscape is most suited to cultivation. It slows in the north and west, where the terrain is harder, the soil thinner, and the farming frontier arrives later. Isotopic evidence from Western Scotland suggests a period of genuine coexistence, genetically distinct hunter-gatherer and farming communities living in proximity for perhaps a few centuries before the hunter-gatherer signal finally disappears. In Ireland, Mesolithic shell midden sites continue to be occupied into the early Neolithic period, suggesting the western margins held out longest. But held out is the right phrase. The direction of change never reverses. The Coldrum Long Barrow in Kent, one of the earliest dated Neolithic monuments in Britain at around 3900 BCE, contained the remains of 17 individuals whose genomes were among those analyzed in the 2019 study. And every one of them carries overwhelmingly Anatolian-derived farmer ancestry. This is a monument built within a century or two of the Neolithic's arrival in Britain by people who are already genetically the dominant population. The speed implied by that finding is striking. The farming communities arriving in Britain are not slowly establishing themselves over generations before their population grows large enough to displace the hunter-gatherers. They are arriving in numbers, and the displacement is happening fast. What the replaced people experienced across the generations of this process is something the genetics alone cannot tell us, and the archaeology tells us only partially. What it does tell us is that Mesolithic material culture, the microliths, the bone tools, and the practices associated with the hunter-gatherer way of life effectively disappears from the British archaeological record after 4000 BCE. There is no prolonged period of Mesolithic tools appearing alongside Neolithic ones across most of Britain, no long transitional phase in which the two material cultures coexist. The hunter-gatherer world does not fade gradually. It stops. And when it stops, the people who made it are already, in genetic terms, mostly gone. The silence that follows the replacement is itself significant. The knowledge system the hunter-gatherers carried, 30,000 years of ecological understanding, the names they had for the rivers and hills, the stories that encoded survival information across generations, the language they spoke, all of it disappears without trace. When no descendant population carries it forward, no fragment of it survives in the archaeological record. The forest they managed and knew is cleared. The seasonal routes they followed are abandoned. The exchange networks they maintained across the island collapse. What the replacement leaves behind is a Britain that looks, in its material culture, its genetics, and its relationship with the land, entirely unlike the Britain that existed before. The door closes, and it closes completely. The farming frontier does not advance at the same speed everywhere. In the south and east of Britain, the flat, fertile lowlands closest to the Channel crossing, the Neolithic establishes itself within decades of arrival, and the Mesolithic signal disappears from the archaeological record almost immediately. But in the west and north, the rocky coasts of Wales, the uplands of Scotland, the islands of the Inner Hebrides, the picture is more complicated and more human. These are the places where the Old World holds on longest, where the two ways of living coexist in the same landscape for longer than anywhere else in Britain, and where the evidence gives us the clearest glimpse of what the transition actually looked like at ground level. The Isle of Islay off the west coast of Scotland is where this story is most legible. Radiocarbon dating from multiple Mesolithic and Neolithic sites on the island, analyzed in a 2022 study by Professor Stephen Mithen of the University of Reading, identifies a period between roughly 3,787 and 3,645 BCE, when two distinct populations were present on the island simultaneously. Indigenous hunter-gatherers and incoming farmers occupying the same small piece of land for perhaps a century or more. Western Scotland is the only confirmed region in all of Britain where ancient DNA shows interbreeding between the two populations. Everywhere else, the boundary held. Here, briefly, it did not. What that coexistence looked like in practice is something the evidence allows us to sketch but not fully draw. The Oronce middens, the shell midden sites that accumulated across centuries of repeated seasonal use discussed in the previous video, continue to receive deposits into the early Neolithic period. The people using them are still fishing, still exploiting the coastal resources that have sustained the Western Scottish communities for millennia, still returning to the same locations season after season in the pattern of the Mesolithic world. Meanwhile, Neolithic material culture, pottery, polished axes, the first clearances, is appearing at other sites on the adjacent islands. Two economies running in parallel on the same coastline. The three scenarios that researchers have proposed for what happened on Islay capture the range of possibilities visible across Western Scotland as a whole. The first is swift succession. A brief period of contact followed quickly by the disappearance of the hunter-gatherers, through a combination of demographic pressure and limited interbreeding. But the second is a dual population model. The two groups coexisting in the same area for an extended period, possibly using the same locations at different times, but with little sustained contact or mixing. The third, which Mithen cautiously favors based on the Islay evidence, is biocultural merger. A genuine blending of the two populations and their practices, producing communities with mixed ancestry and mixed economies that combined hunting, fishing, and early pastoralism. The honest answer is that all three probably happened in different places and at different times across the western margins. The Yorkshire evidence offers a different kind of last holdout. The very latest Mesolithic sites identified through Bayesian modeling of radiocarbon dates in Yorkshire cluster in specific landscape locations, upland areas, river valleys, places that have been foci of hunter-gatherer activity for hundreds of years, and that the researchers who studied them describe as ancestral or persistent places. These are not random campsites. They are locations with meaning, returned to across generations because they carry history, the kind of deep landscape attachment that makes a people reluctant to abandon a place even when the world around it is changing. The Yorkshire hunter-gatherers of the early 4th millennium BCE are not retreating randomly. They are holding specific ground. The persistence of wild resource exploitation in the early Neolithic complicates the clean boundary between the two worlds. At numerous early Neolithic sites across Britain, The faunal assemblages contain substantial quantities of wild animal bones alongside the domesticated cattle, sheep, and pig that define the Neolithic economy. Red deer in particular never disappears from the British Neolithic diet. It remains a significant food source, and its antler remains a critical raw material throughout the period. Whether this reflects hunter-gatherers incorporated into farming communities, or farmers maintaining hunting as a supplement to their primary subsistence, or genuine mixed economy communities, is a question the bones alone cannot answer. What it tells us is that the boundary between the two worlds was permeable in both directions, at least for a time. The genetic signal from Western Scotland is small, but real, and its smallness is itself informative. The interbreeding that the DNA confirms between Mesolithic and Neolithic populations in this region contributed only a minor fraction to the ancestry of the resulting population. The Neolithic farmer ancestry dominates even in the region where mixing occurred most. The hunter-gatherers who merged with the incoming farmers in Western Scotland did not transform the Neolithic communities they joined. They were absorbed by them. Their genes survive in the resulting population at low levels, their specific knowledge and practices contributing something unknown to a world already being built on fundamentally different foundations. By around 3,500 BCE, the Mesolithic world is over. The last communities maintaining a hunter-gatherer way of life in the margins of Western Scotland and Ireland have either been absorbed into farming populations and moved beyond the reach of the advancing frontier, which by this point covers the entire island, or simply ended. The shell middens stop accumulating. The microlith scatters stop appearing in new contexts. The exchange networks that once linked Mesolithic communities across the full breadth of Britain fall silent. What replaces them is a Neolithic landscape of cleared fields, long barrows, and causewayed enclosures that covers the island from Cornwall to Caithness. The old world does not leave a grave. It leaves an absence. And the absence, once you know to look for it, is everywhere. The people who replace the hunter-gatherers bring with them not only a different way of feeding themselves, but a different way of organizing the world. The Mesolithic mind, shaped by 30,000 years of mobile life in a forest, and understood the landscape as a living system to be read and moved through. A world of relationships, of seasonal return, of knowledge carried in memory and renewed through practice. The Neolithic mind understands it differently. Land is not something to move through. It is something to own, to work, to mark, and to pass to your children. The long barrow expresses this difference more clearly than any other object the Neolithic leaves behind. A mobile hunter-gatherer band cannot build a long barrow, not because they lack the intelligence or the labor, but because a long barrow only makes sense if you intend to stay. It anchors the dead to a specific piece of ground, and through them anchors the living. The ancestors in the barrow are the title deed. They are the proof that this land belongs to this community, and expressed in stone and earth and bone in a form that weathers centuries. The collective burial tradition inside long barrows reflects a conception of personal identity fundamentally different from the Mesolithic one. Individual bones are mixed together, sorted by type rather than by person. Skulls in one chamber, long bones in another. The remains of men, women, and older individuals commingled into a single ancestral presence. In the Mesolithic, the individual dead were treated with ceremony and care as recognizable persons. In the Neolithic, individual identity dissolves into collective ancestry. The dead become a resource, held in common, available to the whole community. The causewayed enclosure is the social complement to the long barrow. Where the barrow is for the dead, the enclosure is for the living. Periodically, not permanently. The evidence from Windmill Hill in Wiltshire and Hambledon Hill in Dorset shows these sites were visited for feasting, trading, and the processing of the dead before their bones were moved to barrows. Animal bones at causewayed enclosures appear in quantities far beyond what the resident population could consume. The feasting was communal, drawing people from across a wide territory, and the scale of it was deliberate. Food shared in large gatherings creates social obligations. The feast is a political act. The processing of the dead at these enclosures is one of the aspects of early Neolithic practice that most surprises modern audiences. Human bones found in the ditches at Hambledon Hill show marks consistent with excarnation. Bodies exposed to the elements and to birds until the flesh was gone. The bones then collected for transport to long barrows. This was not negligence toward the dead. It was a managed process, sometimes taking months, through which the body was transformed from an individual person into ancestral bone. The dead passed through multiple stages and multiple locations before reaching their final resting place. Death was a journey, not an event. The people building these monuments are also beginning to organize the landscape around them in ways that go beyond individual sites. Long barrows and causewayed enclosures are not placed randomly. They cluster in specific landscape positions, on prominent ridges visible for miles, overlooking river valleys, positioned relative to each other in arrangements that suggest deliberate spatial planning across a wide territory. The ritual landscape, a term archaeologists use for these monument complexes, is itself a kind of architecture built not in stone and timber alone, but in the relationships between structures across miles of cleared ground. The landscape is being made to mean something. One aspect of Neolithic belief that tends to get underemphasized is the role of cattle. At causewayed enclosures and long barrows across Britain, cattle bones are treated with the same deliberateness as human ones. Deposited in specific locations, sometimes arranged in ways that mirror the treatment of human remains, sometimes placed in barrow chambers alongside people. The cattle the Neolithic farmers brought from the continent are not simply livestock. They are status animals, sacrificial animals, animals whose deposition marks significant events. The long-horned cattle of the British early Neolithic, descended from wild aurochs, would have been impressive animals by any measure, and killing one in a communal feast was a statement about wealth, generosity, and social standing that the whole gathering would understand. The Neolithic mind is not the Mesolithic mind, and the difference matters for understanding what the replacement described in the previous section actually meant. It was not simply a swap of one population for another, leaving the landscape and its meaning unchanged. The incoming farmers brought a completely different framework for understanding what land is, what the dead are, what community means, and what a person owes to the place they live in. The forest the hunter-gatherers had known for 30,000 years becomes fields. The ancestors the hunter-gatherers had carried in story and in portable ceremony become bones fixed in stone chambers on hilltops. The world is not just repopulated, it is reimagined. By 3500 BCE, the Neolithic is the only world Britain knows. The cleared fields, the long barrows on the ridgelines, the causewayed enclosures drawing communities from across wide territories. This is the landscape of the island now, and it will deepen and elaborate over the next 1,000 years into something more complex and more monumental still. The hunter-gatherers who preceded it are gone from the genetics, gone from the material culture, gone from any recoverable trace of language or story or belief. What remains of them is almost nothing. And what remains of the Neolithic that replaced them is, in a strange twist, everywhere. The long barrows are still standing, West Kennet in Wiltshire, Wayland's Smithy on the Oxfordshire Downs, Stony Littleton in Somerset, Cairnpapel in Scotland. These are monuments built by people whose genetic line itself barely survives the next 1,000 years, whose entire world will be swept away by a second population replacement as thorough as the first. The Beaker people arriving from the Pontic step around 2400 BCE, will replace roughly 90% of the Neolithic British gene pool within a few centuries. The same demographic arithmetic applied again with the same result. The people who built the long barrows will vanish just as completely as the hunter-gatherers they displaced. Britain's prehistory is, at its genetic core, a sequence of near-total replacements, each one erasing the people of the previous chapter. What does not get replaced is the landscape itself. The forest clearances the Neolithic farmers began will never fully reverse. The wildwood that covered almost all of Britain before 4000 BCE will never return to its pre-Neolithic extent. Centuries of cultivation, grazing, and settlement have altered the soil, the hydrology, and the ecology of the island in ways that are permanent. The open countryside that modern British people think of as natural, the rolling fields, the hedgerows, the chalk downlands, is in its fundamental character a Neolithic creation, maintained and extended across 6,000 years of continued farming since the first axes fell in the ancient woodland. The monument tradition that begins with long barrows will eventually produce Stonehenge, built by the descendants of the Neolithic farmers, elaborated and rebuilt across several centuries, completed in roughly its current form around 1500 BCE. Stonehenge is the most visited prehistoric monument in the world, and almost everyone who stands before it is looking at the end of a tradition that began with the first farmers burying their dead in earthen mounds on the cleared hilltops of southern Britain. The impulse to mark the land with permanent structures, to anchor community identity in stone and earth, to express the relationship between the living and the dead through monuments visible for miles, all of it starts in this period with these people. The question of what modern British people actually inherit from this entire sequence is one that genetics answers with uncomfortable precision. Yet less than 0.1% of modern British ancestry traces to the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the people who lived here for 30,000 years before farming arrived. The Neolithic farmers who replaced them fare only slightly better, surviving in the modern gene pool primarily through the diluted remnant that persisted after the Beaker replacement. The majority of modern British ancestry derives from the Beaker-associated steppe migrations of the Bronze Age and from subsequent Iron Age, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, and Norman movements. The people standing in Britain at any moment in its history have almost never been the direct biological descendants of the people who stood there 1,000 years before. That is not a comfortable fact for anyone seeking a simple story of continuous indigenous ancestry, but it is what the ground and the bones in it actually show. The story told across this video series, from the first Ice Age hunters to the last forest-dwelling foragers to the farmers who cleared the wildwood, is not a story about any modern group's claim to this land. It is a story about what happened here, told as honestly as the evidence allows. The people of Mesolithic Britain were remarkable. The people who replaced them were remarkable in different ways. And the people who replaced those people were remarkable in ways different still. Britain has been home to extraordinary human lives across the full span of its human occupation, and almost none of those lives are the direct ancestors of anyone alive today. The land remembers them, even when the DNA does not. The long barrows are still standing. The cleared fields are still here. And somewhere under the North Sea, the footprints of children playing near a fish trap 11,000 years ago are still pressed into the mud, waiting.